This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G., V! V, Marybeth R., Ida B., Eric N., and Tana. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and this week we are going to continue in the same neck of the woods that we did with the last podcast on the Chthonia gig, which while that is seen all throughout Europe, there tends to be a focus on the ones that are in Ireland, although again, that's probably not where they originated from. However, our focus is going to go back to Ireland, although we're going to be looking at a particular Irish legend with respect to how it connects to some other similar ones, and this is the legend of the Banshee. Now, the Banshee is typically seen as this wailing kind of a figure. There's different descriptions of what the Banshee might look like for people who actually see the Banshee. Sometimes she's conceived of as being a hag-type woman. Sometimes she's conceived of as a washerwoman. That's one of the motifs connected to her. In some versions, she's connected to something known as the death coach. And in others, she is just seen as a sort of a beautiful young woman, like a lady in white type figure, who also is sometimes seen as being portraying her characteristics. And what we see in the Banshee is a woman who is wailing, weeping, or keening. So there's this mournful aspect to her where she's weeping and wailing. And this is often connected with death and with death omens, particularly for certain Irish families. Now, it's been said that these are Irish noble families that have the visitations by the Banshee, but this can also be something that happens within, there have been a couple of cases where people of either Norman or Saxon descent have also had a Banshee attached to them, but that's far less common. I mean, there are a couple occasional examples of it, but it's far less common. So what I want to do is talk about I have a certain structure of what I want to talk about, because really when we talk about the folklore around the Banshee, it's massive. I mean, you could delve way back and you could take a lot of different threads for the origins of this kind of story. You could connect it to funerary rites. You could probably give lots of different examples. So what I want to do just for the purposes of this podcast is I'm structuring it around a few different things. So first of all, we're going to talk about the definition and the description of the Banshee. I have a couple of different ones. I'm going to probably try to stick to the one from O'Hugan's Encyclopedia of Myth, Legend, and Romance on Irish folklore. So that's the one I'm going to mainly use. I'm going to give you one or two stories of the Banshee. I might just stick to one. There's one of them that I was thinking of reading that's really, really long and written. It was translated. It was in one of those Yeats collections where Lady Gregory had written this down, and it was written in the style of the. It's meant to imitate the vocalizing and language style of somebody who is. Irish, what he calls the Irish peasantry. So I don't know that I need to do that kind of play acting for this, and it is somewhat of a little bit of a long story. So I might just stick with shorter one. But in any case, we'll talk a little bit about, give you a story, an example of what's been said about the Banshee, and we're going to talk about the different ways in which those death omens manifest themselves. There's the wailing woman, like I said, the washerwoman, and the death coach. We're going to talk a little bit about each of those motifs, and then we're going to get into the ancient traditions of lamenting, and we're going to compare it to the thing that I probably know the best, which is the ancient Greek, and the idea of goin, and how, because I feel like this most clearly illustrates what may have been some of the original conceptions or purposes that may have been connected to the art of keening, which is what the Banshee is associated with. And of course, the Banshee is also, as we'll see, has some associations with the goddess Morrigan. So we're going to talk about all of those things, and then sort of look at the question of whether or not the Banshee simply predicts death, or whether she's a guide for the dead soul, and talk about the idea of the Banshee as a guardian. So that's roughly the structure of what I want to talk about today. So, not to waste any time, we'll begin at the beginning. So the Banshee, I'm going to read this from O'Hugan's encyclopedia here. It says, female spirit witch, in folk belief, is heard to cry when the death of a member of an Irish family is imminent. The designation means otherworld woman, or woman of the mound, because Ban is woman, and she has to do with a hill. It's connected to the kinds of burial mounds and barrows and that we see. I think they call them tumuli that you see throughout the countryside. And they're not unique to Ireland or England. They do appear in a lot of different places. But any kind of this barrow kind of burials are often associated with this particular mound. And they are considered to be, in many cases, otherworldly entrances or connections. And the Banshee is invariably a solitary being. Her cry is described as plaintive and very much like that of a keening woman of this world. Yeah, and we'll talk about keening. It's usually heard in the vicinity of the family dwelling and therefore near to the location to the person who is about to die. However, some accounts have her cry being heard at the family home, although that person may be far away, even in a foreign country. The Banshee tradition is peculiar to the Gaelic world, and it must have sprung from the idea that a goddess cares for the fortunes of specific noble families. In the early story of, I don't know if you pronounce this, Frick, the impending death of that hero is announced by the cries of otherworld women, and in other texts we read of his own death being foretold to Brian Boru by the goddess Evil, and of the goddess Mor lamenting over the grave of, I think this is, much after this is Cattle looks like Macfinnon is what it looks like. I didn't prepare the Irish for this in advance, so I could have totally messed that up. Okay. That there is continuity between this and the later folklore of the Banshee is strongly suggested by the folk insistence that the Banshee laments only those who have O or Mac in their surname, that is, families of noble Gaelic descent. This notion provides a clue as to how the folk belief developed from the original idea that goddesses protected the rulers and inhabitants of their particular areas. Firstly, it's clear that the folklore is not totally in accord with the literary tradition, which uses the term Banshee or Sheban equally for an otherworld woman, but with somewhat different connotations. Such a woman in the literature is not solely associated with death, but is represented as appearing to inspire poets, and through them to encourage the chieftains to success and prosperity. Yeah, now that sounds more like one of the aspects of the Morrigan in particular, because she has this triple aspect, and one of them is definitely about encouraging success on the battlefield in particular, and she does it through this kind of poetry that's often recited on the battlefield. So that may be what he's referring to here. When she appears in order to lament a dead leader, it is usually after the death has occurred, and according to the age-old convention of kingship, her sorrow is magnified by the fact that the dead hero was her mystical spouse. In folklore, on the other hand, the Banshee is concerned only with death, and with its announcement before it occurs. It is thus clear that the folk tradition has selected but one aspect of the original idea, and has placed it into the context of the general belief in omens presaging death. Such omens, for instance the appearance of certain birds or the hearing of certain noises, are expressions of the folk attitude to the enigma of death. So the Banshee of popular belief, though originally a patron goddess, has become an enigmatic being, a strange voice crying from the portals of the unknown. Now, that's a rather interesting observation. It's a little bit about what we talked about. I was on the Inside the Sacred Circle podcast last night with Joanne Gajewski and Jim Sayers, and we had kind of talked about this idea of, we were talking about these certain very archaic figures. I think Jim was talking about Hecate as kind of an animus mundi, and the way in which her role ends up becoming changed and shifted till she becomes this goddess of witchcraft and demons and so forth, when she was a being that ostensibly had this privilege over everything. You know, she was a very, very powerful titaness, and then kind of gets confined to this role. So interesting when we think about that, and the way in which the feminine powers have been sort of diminished and kind of put in a box. The way that the goddess's voice becomes this voice sort of crying, just kind of this echo of a voice crying and mourning, right? It is difficult to date precisely when this change occurred, but it seems obvious that stress on otherworld women as protectresses of distinctively Gaelic families has to do with the confiscations of land in Ireland by the English government. Aha, well, there's that aspect too. That's a very good point. There are certain indications that the new profile of the Banshee developed in southern Leinster area, probably during the seizure of land there by the English in the 16th and 17th centuries. This area preserves a very special designation for the being. Thus, the Banshee is known in Carlow, Wexford, South Wicklow, and South Kildare as the Bove, and in Kilkenny and South Lass as the Bove. Let's see, I'm not. I want to say Bove Quinta or Quinta, having to do with keening or mourning. And Bove, of course, or Bave or Bove, is actually a name, one of the names of the Morrigan. She is known in the Waterford as the Bove, as the variant of the same word. The designation is in fact a survival of the name Bove, which occurs frequently in the medieval literature as that of a goddess. See Morrigan. Okay. The original meaning of the word, which it still preserves outside of this context, was scald crow, and it was a form of the corpse-hungry war goddess, a form which the corpse-hungry war goddess was said to take. Its survival is, as the usual designation for the Banshee in South Leinster, is probably an echo of the fighting, which was a necessary corollary to the claim on the land in that period. And yes, I've said this, when you're talking about sovereignty goddesses, you're talking about the connection to the land. And it was literally, everything kind of connects, right? I was doing a live stream this morning on my other channel, which is called Transition Life Coaching. And one of the things I was talking about was my connection to Macha. And that was one of the things that I had brought up, is that when you have a sovereignty goddess, you're also dealing frequently with a war goddess, because it has to do with this very thing, that the claiming of the land often means needing to either defend it or fight for it. Belief in the Banshee has survived with surprising strength all over Ireland and in urban as well as rural parts. Although it is claimed that she presages the death only of those with O or Mac in their surnames, in practice, many names of non-Gaelic origin are included in the selection. She is much more often heard than seen, although some people claim to have caught a glimpse of her, and in such accounts she is usually portrayed as old in appearance. And she combs her long white hair as she laments. Now that's interesting, the idea of the comb. I listened to a presentation at a conference last Friday about mermaid imagery, and the fact that frequently you will see mermaids featured holding a comb and holding a mirror. And the comb is something that actually figures in a lot of other folklore too, like the tales of Baba Yaga. The comb actually almost ends up being a kind of, there's a lot of possibilities here, and I don't want to suggest that, this is the absolute meaning of what it is in the Banshee legend, but combs sometimes have this function as being almost like a bridge. I think of the Baba Yaga story where she throws the comb down in it, and it gives her, this bridge, and but it can also where the Vasilisa is able to get across or get away with this comb. So the comb. So if you're talking about the Banshee as being a kind of bridge figure, you might, at least you could speculate a connection there. But interesting that she's often combing her hair. It says a small number of narratives have become attached to her, and it is significant that these are particularly strong in Leinster. The most popular concerns how, after she has been heard to lament at night, a man finds her comb in the morning and takes it into his house. Now, this is another variant on another type of folk motif, but I'll finish this. Next night, a terrific wailing is heard outside his house, accompanied by knocks at the window. Realizing that it is the Banshee seeking her comb, the man puts it in his tongs and gives it to her out through the window. The comb is taken and the tongs twisted or broken, by which the man understands that this would have been the fate of his hand had he not used the tongs. So she was fairly angry with him for that. Now, that reminds me of another tale you will see, and I don't want to divert into that type of tale here, but where you have the idea of the corpse that's buried and somebody decides to take a bone from the body, or there's another version I've seen, I think, in Scary Stories, where the woman takes the liver from the body or something like that. She takes some kind of an organ and then goes to cook and eat it, or they uses it to put as a bone in her soup, and that the the spirit of the dead person starts knocking at the window looking for their bone or looking for their whatever's been taken from them. Or in some case, it's like if someone's wearing a gold ring or some kind of valuable object and it's taken off the corpse, then the deceased will appear to the thief and, to hound them until they get their possession back. So yeah, so that's interesting. So that seems to be connected to that kind of a motif. So if we look at stories of the Banshee, like I said, I have this one. I'm looking at Irish myth, legend, and folklore. It's edited by Yeats, but it was, actually that aspect was edited by Yeats. I think it's the Cuchulainn story was written here by a Lady Gregory. So yeah, this is referred to in his section on the solitary fairies. And there's a whole long story about how Thomas Connolly met the Banshee, but it's quite a long read. So I'm just going to go. There's a lamentation that was written for the death of Sir Maurice Fitzgerald, a knight of Kerry who was killed in Flanders in 1642. And this is in the form of a poem, and it was translated from the Irish. And it's by Clarence Mangan, I think is the name here. Okay. There was lifted up one voice of woe, one lament of more than mortal grief, through the wide south to and fro for a fallen chief. In the dead of night that cry thrilled through me. I looked out upon the midnight air. My own soul was all as gloomy as I knelt in prayer. O'er Loch Gur that night once, twice, yea thrice, passed a wail of anguish for the brave, that her half curled into ice, its moon mirroring wave. Then uprose a many-toned wild hymn in choral swell from Ogre's dark ravine, and Mowgli's phantom woman mourned the Geraldine. Far on Cara Mona's emerald plains, shrieks and sighs were blended many hours, and Fermoy in fitful strains answered from her towers. Yogo, Kinomiki, Imokili mourned in concert, and their piercing keen woke to wondering life the stilly glens of Inchiqueen. From Lochmo to yellow Dunanore there was fear. The traders of Tralee gathered up their golden store and prepared to flee. For in ship and hall from night till morning showed the first faint beamings of the sun. All foreigners heard the warning of the dreaded one. This they spake portendeth death to us, if we not fly swiftly from our fate. Self-conceited idiots thus, ravingly to prate. Not for base-born higgling Saxon trucksters rings lament like those by shore and sea, not for churls with souls like hucksters waileth our Banshee. For the high Milesian race alone ever flows the music of her woe, for slain heir to bygone throne, and now for chief laid low. Hark, again methinks I hear her weeping, yonder is she near me now as then, or was but the night wind sweeping down by the hollow glen. Okay. And this is where he tries to say that, yes, the people who hear the Banshee and run away because they think it's for them, and he's like, you're not good enough for the Banshee. But as has been pointed out, the Banshee doesn't seem to be limited. Technically, my family name, which is Burke, would not be a name that would have its own Banshee because it's a Norman name. I mean, Burke is actually from de Burgh or de Burgo, and that's a French name. And even though the Burke family has been in Ireland for a very long time, and Burke is just about as Irish as some of these other names, it is originally a Norman name. So I don't know. I don't know. There are actually other stories surrounding Burkes, but we won't digress into those. I was actually, when I was married years ago, I was married to an O'Brien. So technically, his family could have potentially had its own Banshee, because the O'Briens are actually one of the clans that are specifically mentioned. In fact, they have the one that we were referring to as Avil is specifically a kind of spirit. She's a Banshee who is sort of queen of a she. She's queen of a particular fairy mound, and she is actually the guardian of that clan. And there's stories about her connected to that. So let me actually tell you a little bit about that story. The name is supposed to be come from the Gaelic word for beauty, although some say it could come from the Proto-Celtic for a burning fire, which might be a byword for the notion of being arduous. Okay, so this is this is Lady Gregory, her discussion of Avil. She says, and Avil, another woman of the She, made her dwelling place in Craigleet at the time of the battle of Clontar, and she set her love on a young man of Munster, I'm not going to be able to say his name. Artigan is the last part of the name, that had been sent away in disgrace by the King of Ireland. But before the battle, he came back to join with Morcott. Well, anyway, I'm sure I'm saying that totally wrong. The king's son, and to fight for the Gael. And Eivil came to stop him, and when he would not stop with her, she put a druid covering about him the way no one could see him. So in other words, she kind of cloaked him with an invisibility cloak. And he went where the king's son was fighting, and he made a great attack on the enemies of Ireland and struck them down on every side. And the king's son looked around him and said, "It seems to me I hear the sound of blows of Artigan, but I do not see him. I do not see himself." Then he threw off the druid covering that was about him and said, "I will not keep this covering upon me when you cannot see me through it. And come now across the plain to where Eivil is, for she can give us news of the battle." So they went to where she was, and she bade them both to quit the battle, for they would lose their lives in it. But the king's son said to her, "I will tell you a little true story," he said, "that fear for my own body will never make me change my face. And if we fall," he said, "the strangers will fall with us. And it is many a man will fall by my own hand, and the Gael will be sharing their strong places." And so she says, "Stop with me," to the other young man. She said then, "and you will have 200 years of happy life with myself." And he says, "I will not give up the king's son or my own good name for silver or gold." And there was anger on Eivil's when he said that, and she said that the king's son would fall, and you yourself will fall, and your proud blood will be on the plain tomorrow. And they went back into the battle and got their death there. And it was Eivil who gave a golden harp to the son of, I think it's Mirda, by the time he was getting his learning at the school of the Sidhe in Connacht, and he had heard his father had got his death by the king of Lochlin, and whoever heard this playing of this harp would not live long after it. And Mirda's son went where the 3 sons of the king of Lochlin were, and played on his harp for them, and then they died. And it was this harp that Cuchulainn heard at the time that his enemies were gathering against him at, I'm not going to try to read the name, and he knew at that time that his life was near its end. Okay, so we've got this story here. So we've got a couple of concepts. We have the idea of the Banshee as one that is weeping and wailing for the loss of somebody from a noble Irish family. Okay, that was the poem that we had read in the Yeats compilation. And this one is more about a particular banshee, but she is more, when we talk about this woman who falls in love with the young man and says, "Go, come marry me and live with me happily for 200 years. She seems to clearly come from a place where, she's probably not an old hag. She's probably a beautiful woman, although it's not specifically stated here. There is something in the Lady Fanshawe in her memoirs, and it's Lady Wild says, okay, this is a description, this is from Wikipedia. "Sometimes the Banshee has long streaming hair, which she may be seen combing, with some legend specifying she can only keen while combing her hair." So again, that kind of drops a hint about keening as being this kind of bridge thing, as I was suggesting, that the comb potentially meaning that. She wears a gray cloak over a green dress. So we have this shrouded kind of, in the way that a fog or a mantle might also be an omen, over the green, which of course the green would be that, could represent that fertility and that bloom of nature, right? And her eyes are red from continual weeping. She may be dressed in white with red hair and a ghastly complexion, according to a first-hand account by Anne Lady Fanshawe in her memoirs. Okay, in white with red hair. Okay, so that's almost akin more to like a Macha type figure, or Morrigan type figure. Okay. Lady Wilde in her books provides others. Okay, and Lady Wilde says, "The size of the Banshee is another physical feature that differs between regional accounts. Though some accounts of her standing unnaturally tall are recorded, the majority of tales that describe her height state the Banshee's stature as short, anywhere between 1 foot and 4 feet. Her exceptional shortness often goes alongside the description of her as an old woman, though it may be intended to emphasize her state as a fairy creature. Sometimes the Banshee assumes the form of some sweet-singing virgin of the family who died young, and has been given the mission by the invisible powers to become the harbinger of coming doom to her mortal kindred." Now, this idea actually goes back to the idea of the Furies, which are also connected to the Morrigan, at least in terms of how the Romans saw her, and that's and the Furies, the assistants of the Furies are often virgin girls who died. When I did a podcast on the Aori, and that's what I'm referring to there. They're these virgin girls, these girls who died before they had a chance to produce an heir or, produce children. And so they become these kinds of assistants of these goddesses that either have to do with death or portents of death, or just with the Furies themselves, of course, have to do with sort of an element of conscience, I should say, as connected to families particularly, and certain aspects of the ancestral line. So this to me seems to be another variant of the Aori. Okay, the Banshee is an Aori. And has been given the mission by the invisible powers to become the harbinger of doom to her mortal kindred. Or she may be seen at night as a shrouded woman crouched beneath trees, lamenting with a veiled face, or flying past in the moonlight, crying bitterly. And the cry of this spirit is mournful beyond all other sounds on earth, and betokens certain death to some member of the family whenever it is heard in the silence of night. So, in John O'Brien's Irish-English Dictionary, the entry for Shebrew, it states, hence the Banshee, or the plural Nashi, which is Nas is another term for woman. She-fairies or women-fairies, credulously supposed by the common people to be so affected to certain families that they are heard to sing mournful lamentations about their houses by night, whenever any of the family labors under a sickness which is to end by death. But no families which are not of an ancient and noble stock are believed to be honored with this fairy privilege. So again, we've talked about this. Now, the next thing we really want to talk about with the connection to the Banshee, we kind of have this idea of what she's like. Let's talk about some of the motifs that are connected with her. We are going to talk about keening, but I do want to talk about that separately. So the motifs around the Banshee are, okay, we talk about the idea of a death coach. Now, one story that we really see that in, there's was it Darby O'Gill and the Little People, where the Banshee is actually the one who sends the death coach. So she's not only the one who portends a death, but she sends the death coach to come fetch the soul of the person who is going to be brought to the other world, or to wherever the dead go. And of course, he doesn't want his daughter to go, so he manages to get a wish from a leprechaun who tells him, and where he says, "I want to take my daughter's place in this coach." And so so he gets his wish, and the death coach comes for him, but the leprechaun manages to trick him out of sort of into voiding his wish. So then he gets thrown out of the death coach. But it's in the interest of saving his daughter. But the idea is that it's the Banshee who comes and who actually is the one who calls the death coach. You see the death coach in a lot of stories. I know there's some Victorian ghost stories that refer to it as well. There was a very interesting one about, I forget what the title of it is. I feel like it was an E.F. Benson story. But it was one where there was somebody who heard. It was a man who was woken up from his apartments that he was living in, to see a coach pull up, and the driver opened the door and said, "There's room for one more," and was calling to him, and he said, "Oh no, I no thanks, I don't need that." But then, and he thought it was sort of very, very curious. And I can't remember though in that story if somebody else actually got into the coach, but they kept saying there was a driver who opened the door and basically said, "There's room for one more." And he didn't really understand this. He thought it was odd. He had asked about a coach showing up, and nobody else seemed to see this. So the next day he had been in London, and probably, it's interesting, I think they were saying around the area of St. Pancras, which is an area I know pretty well. And he was waiting for a bus, and this bus was absolutely packed with people. And the driver says to him, "There's room for one more." And he immediately recalls the dream of the other night, and he says, "No, never mind, I'll wait till the next one." And as it turns out, the bus got into a terrible accident right after, almost immediately after, and everybody on the bus was killed. So it was almost the death coach showed up as this omen of death. And when the death coach appears, if you get into it, it's presumably you're being taken. And the idea is that the coach really comes for dead souls. It doesn't come for people who are living or who are meant to be living. So it really kind of falls into that type of portent. And also you have the idea of the washerwoman at the ford, which is another common association with the Banshee. And we have to remember, of course, that Banshee is a fairy woman. I mean, the idea of being from the She. I mean, there's definitely this connection to the other world and to the world of fairy. So this woman always is a type of guardian spirit that comes from that realm, and this is why I think this is thought of as a particularly Celtic, or at least a particularly Irish phenomenon, whether strictly Celtic or not. And this fairy woman is in those particular instances, and again we see these very strongly connected with the Morrigan, though there are some other examples in Welsh folklore and in other places where there are similar kinds of figures. She's seen there basically washing, and so when you pass the washing woman, she's either washing bloody clothes, bloody armor, or she's washing a bloody chariot. All of those examples have been given. And I actually do address all of those examples in my Morrigan book, which hopefully is coming out the end of this year. We'll see. Obviously, I still continue to keep people updated on what's happening with that when I know. But there's the idea that there is that you see this woman, and if anybody stops to talk to this woman, she usually gives them an omen of their doom or their death. And sometimes there are stories where certain men have poo-pooed it and said, "Oh, that's just some old woman trying to scare us." But then, in fact, the death does actually happen, and it could be in battle. It could be, in some cases, the stories of the hostels. I'm not remembering the exact titles because there's a couple different ones in Irish literature. It usually becomes the reason the Morrigan can be involved is because there's often a violation of a taboo as well that could be occurring, and that's what causes the chieftain or the leader or the warrior to lose, because they violate the taboo that's on them. They all have certain restrictions. Sometimes in some cases, like with Cuchulainn, I think the Morrigan actually tricks him into violating these taboos. She appears to him as an old woman, and she's cooking. She offers him dog meat. And see, now Cuchulainn, two of his strictures are, one is that he can never refuse hospitality, but two is he is not allowed to eat dog meat. So really, he's in a position where he's going to violate them one way or the other. He's either going to he's going to violate it by eating the dog meat or violate it by refusing the hospitality. So that's how the Morrigan kind of gets him, and whatever protections he has that are maintained by observing those taboos, they end up taking away a lot of his power. They make him vulnerable. Okay, violating those taboos makes him vulnerable. So. And this is the case where you start to see these omens. Now, in addition to the Bove or Bave, the crow aspect of the Morrigan that provides these omens, you also have Nevin, which is often considered to be the third aspect of the Morrigan. Sometimes there's some variations on that, but oftentimes it's Macha, Bove, and Nevin are the three. So Nevin is also she seems to be the wife of the war goddess, or the war god. Sorry, in the, at least in terms of what the Book of Invasions has said about these particular figures. And the stuff about the Morrigan is kind of all over the place, and it's in many different families and many different timelines, not just the Tuatha De Danann. It's in many other ones in Irish folklore. So she is. Yeah, so you have this figure who appears. Regardless, you as O'Hogan indicated, you have this figure who's an omen of death, and there's so much in the Banshee that very much resembles the characteristics of the Morrigan. And sometimes I don't know if the stories are conflating the two, and then there's the question of whether or not they're really the same being, or the Banshee is just some kind of later folkloric aspect of that goddess that has been kind of isolated, and that's the bit that we actually remember. And of course, her connection to Irish ancestral families just might be the fact that she is this old Irish spirit that deals with the people who are considered to be the, I don't know if you want to call them the legitimate heirs of Ireland. And as he points out, the fact that there was this sort of takeover of a lot of Irish lands by the English, that may well be part of that, because there's a whole lot about the sovereignty of Ireland once. I've talked a lot about the sovereignty of Ireland once it decided to become a Christian country. And, once the sovereignty goddess no longer had her place. And what I feel that actually ends up meaning, which probably a lot of people would disagree with, but to me, it's always just very curious that you see this first, you have this domination by the church, and then you have this domination by the English that comes in, and it just seems to create these cycles. And of course, there are a lot of people in Ireland now who are trying to reconnect to that energy of the Morrigan. So it's yeah. So and I often felt like in my own contacts and communications with her, such as they are, or however you want to interpret them, I've always sort of felt like there was always that sense of feeling like she was betrayed by somebody, like she was betrayed, like, you abandoned me for that kind of thing. There was almost that kind of energy. So yeah. So anyway, that's just an interpretive thing. That's not anything that we can talk about in an academic or evidentiary sense, but it is something that I think about. Okay, so let me talk about the art of keening, okay? Because keening is a specific, it's the kind of wailing and weeping that people do at funerals. They're lamentations, and usually it is women who are weeping and wailing, and in some cases you even have like hired keeners, like women who are hired to come in and to perform the weeping and wailing, which is very curious. But there are a few things to remember here. So first, let's just talk about keening and what it is. And it says it comes from the Irish and Scottish Gaelic term, I think it's keena, meaning to cry or to weep. And its references to it from the 7th, 8th, and 12th centuries are extensive. Now it's seen as a form of sean-nós singing. Is performed in the Irish and Scottish Gaelic languages. Okay, so when one actually keens, okay, it says in the 12th century, Geraldus Cambrensis, or Gerald of Wales, described vocal laments taking place in which the mourners were divided in two, each alternately singing their part and sometimes joining in full chorus. Written sources that describe the singing style appear from the 16th century onward. In ancient times, a chief's own bard, assisted by the chief's household, would perform the funeral song. More recently, keeners would be hired female mourners, and as I mentioned, the mourners accompanied the keening women with physical movements involving rocking and kneeling. The Irish tradition of keening over the body during the funeral procession and at the burial site is distinct from the wake, the practice of watching over the corpse, which takes place the night before the burial and may last for more than one night. The practice of keening was generally adhered to throughout Ireland, irrespective of social class, until around the middle of 18th century. Around 1781, the antiquarian William Beaufort described in detail the practice of keening at a traditional Irish funerary ceremony and transcribed the keening melodies that were sung. He provided the following information. First, the bards prepared the keen in advance. Second, the body, ornamented with flowers, was placed on a bier or some elevated spot. The relations in keeners were arranged in two divisions, one at the head and the other at the foot of the corpse. The chief bard of the head chorus began by singing the first stanza in a low, doleful tone, which was softly accompanied by the harp. The conclusion, the foot semi-chorus, began the lamentation, or the ulalu, from the final note of the preceding stanza, in which they were answered by the head semi-chorus, then they both united in one general chorus. The chorus of the first stanza being ended, the chief bard of the foot semi-chorus began the second goal or lamentation, in which they were answered by that of the head as before, both united in full general chorus. The genealogy, rank, possessions, and virtues and vices of the dead were rehearsed, and a number of interrogations were addressed to the deceased, as why did he die, if married whether his wife was faithful to him, his sons dutiful, or good hunters or warriors, if a woman whether her daughters were fair or chaste, if a young man whether he had been crossed in love, or in the blue-eyed maids of Erin had treated him with scorn. And says Samuel Carter Hall described Irish funeral traditions and keening songs in his 1841 book Ireland, Its Scenery, Character, and History. He said mourners would rock back and forth and clasp their hands together during the keening song. And so, yes, so they talk about the parallels in Homeric, Etruscan, and biblical times. Certainly, yeah. And really, though, if you think about the fact that Irish lineage I mean, we don't need to take the Book of Invasions at face value. It's a medieval text, and of course, it always tries to connect it to something biblical. But the DNA evidence for some of the oldest settlers in Ireland do seem to come out of the Mediterranean region. There does seem to be that connection to Greece and to that Mesopotamian area of the world. So certainly some of the oldest bones that have been found in Ireland may have that connection. So now, again, whether that means we're talking about, and the idea of of keening is something that's came to Ireland from another place, that or not necessarily. I mean, I would say not necessarily. And the reason that I say that is because I feel that the art of keening actually has another bit of a deeper meaning. They were saying here, just to kind of finish what's said here, it says the wailing would be the first warning of the household of death, and that banshees were also said to sing these keening laments. And as you can see, these are organized songs. It's not just random. It's not just random screaming. It's actually there is a structure to it. It is an actual lament. And it says the keening women have been the human structural adjunct of the banshee. And it says Keening in County Kerry was said to be the closest to the wailing of an actual banshee. And they were talking about some survivals into the 20th century. Okay, so what I want to talk about are a couple of different things about when it comes to the art of keening. So one, I'm going to look at Sarah Iles Johnston's books, The Restless Dead, which a frequent reference text for me. And she has a chapter, which I've referred to before, and I know I refer to it specifically in my book, Death and the Maiden, called To Honor and Avert. And this has to do with the relationship with the dead, the Greek and Roman relationship to the dead. And often, of course, death, like birth, was considered to be a form of pollution. So let me just read here what's been said. This has to do with funeral rituals and the laws of Solon, which is an interesting aspect. So there's prothesis, which is actually kind of like the waking of the body, was one day. This would fit in the fact that it was on the third day after death, counting inclusively, that the body was carried to the place of burial, the ekphora. Let me see actually if I have a better definition of prothesis, if she says that here. Oh, okay. Following the death, the body was washed and laid out by the women of the family. So that's the prothesis. And then the burial is 3 days later, and that's called the ekphora. Okay. The swiftness of burial reflects not only the obvious need to remove a decomposing corpse quickly, but the perception that the individual no longer belonged amongst the living. As many anthropological studies have discussed, in ancient Greece and elsewhere, death initiates a rite of passage for both the deceased and those left behind. The passage begins to approach completion only when the corpse has been removed from the company of the living. So, yeah, there was this idea of to honor and avert. So you respect the dead, you give them the proper rites and the proper burials, but you also remove them as a pollution from the world of the living. Now they are something taboo. You want to get them out of the community. Now you can talk about the health reasons for doing that, but there was also, it certainly had to do with their fear of the numinosity of death. The deceased was accompanied to the grave by family members, and perhaps by other mourners too, although funerary legislation of the late archaic and classical periods sometimes restricted the number of people who might participate, as well as the places at which they might sing their laments. In Athens, for example, Solon passed laws to the effect that only women over the age of 60 or women closely related to the deceased might take part in the ekphora and the lament. Now, that's interesting. So, in other words, the ones who can do the wailing lament, which they also had in ancient Greece, were limited to women of a certain age or women who were close family members. Okay, so where we might therefore get the idea of the banshee as some kind of an older woman. Now, again, this is Greece. This is not Ireland. But there may be this sort of connotation of this being a task of the older generation. Solon's laws curbed the most extreme forms of behavior during Lamentations, such as self-laceration, which is interesting, people actually self-harming themselves, mourning for anyone other than the person immediately dead, which I guess was a thing, and excessive funeral gifts as well. He also ordered that the prothesis take place inside a house and that the ekphora take place before sunrise on the day after the prothesis. Okay, so they didn't want it to be a daytime ceremony. It had to be done really at dawn. Plato's laws for funerary conduct in his ideal city take all of these ideas a bit further. Real laws in some other places similarly aim to restrict the ostentation of the funeral and the number of people lamenting or otherwise participating, and the degree to which it was made public. Okay, so really I mentioned that because this is a reference to the law of Solon that limited the behavior, the amount of keening and lamenting that could be done. And there may be a number of reasons for this. Like with the ostentation, maybe there's something about the ceremonies that people felt got out of hand or too above board. Maybe they caused some chaos. I don't know. But one of the things that we definitely do need to consider with this is the fact that this weeping and wailing may actually serve a certain kind of ritual function. And it would be the type of ritual function that would make people afraid, like anything dealing with death. And from this, I'm going to turn back to Jake Stratton Kent's Geosophia, another one of my favorite books to reference. And in his chapter in Volume 1 on the identity of the magician, and this is around page 124, if you have the Bibliothèque Rouge edition, he says, the use of goin, okay, now goin is, let's see, where does he have it here? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I find the right section. Okay, yeah, actually I want to go to the bottom here. Because they were talking about a goin, they were talking about Jesus as being kind of a goin or a goes. Plato definitely has certainly disdain for what they call the goose or the goes, which is a type of magician, okay? But here, the term goin, Jake points out something here. He says, in addition, he says, the etymology of goin connects with other Greek words signifying lamentation, particularly a lament for the dead. The goin was one who performs a lament in the funerary rites of early Greek religion. Eustathius, a highly esteemed Greek commentator on Homer flourishing at Constantinople in 1170 CE, derives goin from gous, to moan, a mournful sound. He defines the goin as ton metagoun epidonta, one who utters the incantations and spells in a mournful tone. So on the next page, he has a little chart here. So he has the word goeo, which means to wail, to groan, weep, to lament, or to mourn or weep for. Goin or goeten, which is plural, a wizard or an enchanter with lamentations. Goetes, which is a wailer or a mourner. Goetis, which is a witch or a sorceress. Goetia, which is witchcraft or sorcery. Goetio, spellbinding or enchanting something, and goose, which is weeping, wailing, or groaning. So he's pointing out the connections between all these words within the same language family. The goin, who for various reasons cannot be termed he, was originally quite distinct from the antisocial and marginalized sorcerer. On the contrary, the arts of the goeten were performed openly on behalf of the community. Later on, the term came to be loosely interchangeable with others, such as the pharmakoi, who took their name from the drugs employed, and so on. Whereas these neuter terms refer to the arts practiced, the etymology of goetia is the goin, a person. Now, we think of goetia now as the summoning of demons, right? We think about the Key of Solomon, or we think of the True Grimoire, or we think of I'm trying to think of one of the other ones. There's the Greater Key, there's the Lesser Key. There's a few. There's a lot of different ones actually. Like all the names are not. If I walked over to my bookshelf, I do have a few of them, so I could read off all the names. But nonetheless, I mean, those are some of the more recognizable ones. The etymology of goetia is the goin, a person. It's not the arts that are practiced that define the goetin and their abilities, but personal inner resources, what might be termed their goetness or goethood. This is only to be expected from a phase of culture wherein magic is not perceived as specialized or marginalized sphere of activity, but permeates the whole of existence. So somebody who has sort of an ability or has this kind of transitionary role, like there's something that like a gift they have of being able to work with the dead. Now, when we talk about the goin in this particular context, what I've often taught, and when I teach my students, when I teach them about the ancient Greek and Roman, particularly the Greek underworld, is that this particular type of lamenting or howling or wailing, which may, again, that might be a disputed etymology, but I think there's a strong case here that these are connected. That these lamentations are that they actually serve a purpose, because the whole funerary rite in general is something that needs to be performed. Like if we look at the death of Patroclus in the Iliad, for example, and he appears to Achilles in a dream saying, hey, you got to bury my body, because otherwise, if the proper rites are not performed, the dead soul could be stuck, and they could become a kind of restless spirit living between the this world and the other world, because they would not be able to enter the underworld. So they would be stuck, but they also can't return to the realm of earth. So in order for that passage to be completed, all of the proper funerary rites have to be observed. In Antigone, the play which is one of the Oedipus plays, Antigone ends up, her brother is, when he is killed, she is... the Creon does not want him to be buried because he was one of the seven against Thebes. He was the one who kind of rebelled and tried to usurp the kingship, and they won't let it. It basically was forbidden for anybody to perform proper burial rites. So she does some kind of modified version over the body where she sprinkles it with water and does some kind of a it makes some kind of a ritual gesture to allow his soul to pass. And for doing this, she ends up being, they say that she's buried alive, but she's basically walled up in a tomb and then she ends up hanging herself. So yeah, it's a happy story. Oedipus, the whole Oedipus trilogy is really considered to be a tragedy. Although Oedipus at Colonus is rather interesting ending to that. But anyway, it says, so to go on with Jake, he says, in literary sources, this lamenting magician was also called a psychagoge, or guide of souls, a term which had the additional meaning of necromancer. In the play The Persians by Aeschylus, the works of the psychagoge are in the magical effects inherent in the act of lamenting, guin, are usefully portrayed. There's a dramatic scene where the shade of the Persian Emperor Darius is summoned by the rites of a royal hero cult, which is highly illustrative. And he quotes, and you around my tomb, chanting the lofty strain, whose solemn air draws forth the dead, with grief-attempered notes, mournfully call me. Okay, so we don't need to kind of get deeply into that, but what you need to understand is that this lament is not only part of what the song of the dead, the song that actually helps the dead to move on to their next destination. It almost guides the way. But that there is a version of that song that can be used to also bring the dead back if you actually want to consult them through an act of necromancy. So therefore we see the fearful power of the funeral rite and of the lamentation, because the lamentation is meant to bring the dead person to the other world, but the sorcerer who knows that particular lament can potentially bring that soul back. And bring it to stand before, because the dead, one of the features of the ancient dead, regardless of how weak they were, because really what you're dealing with, the aspects of the soul in ancient religion, the soul had multiple parts. So let's just say, at least in ancient Greece, in the most basic way of thinking about it, you have the psyche or the psyche, which is the substantial conscious part of your soul, the really life force of you. And then that's the part that would actually fly, that would be portrayed as having wings of some kind. There was a certain aviary component to talking about the soul. And then you would have, I think the word for soul actually comes from the word for wind, but it has to do with the idea of being sailing on the wind, kind of. And then you have the eidolon, which is the aspect of your soul, which is more of a shade or a shadow that ends up in the underworld. And that is the aspect that if you were to pay a visit to Hades, or if you were to perform a necromantic ritual, you would be invoking the eidolon. And in order for the eidolon to have the strength to communicate with you, you would have to have a blood offering. That's frequently why they would sacrifice a black ram, like the pool of blood it would be something the dead could drink from, because blood was seen to be the life, containing the life force. So having some of the life force, they would have the strength to speak to you. Now, one of the things the dead are able to do, and this is pretty much ubiquitous throughout Near Eastern culture, is that they're able to see the future. They can not only see things that you can't, but they can see the future. So the dead were frequently consulted to give knowledge of the future of an event, or sometimes even to find things that were lost. I mean, there's a variety of reasons that you will see throughout Greek and Roman literature as to why these beings are called up. But in this sense, though, the Goin or Goit or Goitin has or the Goitin plural have a very terrible power, because this is power that's connected to the dead. And traditionally in cultures, when you have somebody who deals in the realm of the dead, that's considered to be an unclean space, and an impure space. So when you have somebody who has the power to move in and out of that space, there's almost something shamanistic. That's why you will often hear about the goete as being compared to a shaman, because there is this element of moving back and forth between the realms. And again, when the title of Sarah Iles Johnston's chapter, "To Honor and to Avert," a person who does that is really almost in some ways like a dead person, or a dead soul, because it's somebody who it's like you may honor and respect, but it's also somebody who belongs in a different realm, which is frequently why you would have people who perform that kind of magic or have this magic of going between worlds, living outside the community somewhere, though respected by the community for their powers, or maybe visited, but they did not usually take part. They were on the outskirts. That's why you'll see a lot of these witchy figures who live in the woods and so forth. They're not part of the community. And I read an interesting thing. What's her last name? Zeitlin, is that what it is? I read it actually on the Chthonia live stream the other day, a little bit of it. But it's a piece on the kind of funerary rituals and rites and marriage rites and other things that we see in ancient Greece that's connected to women. And it was noted that women were both considered, that birth and death were both considered impure events. Even though the birth of a child is considered to be a great thing, the actual state of giving birth, and possibly because they're very messy states, that they're not cleanly. We think of purity as being clean and hygienic. Giving birth is a messy affair, and dying is a messy affair too. What happens to the body? But these were only the domains. These were the domains of women. Women were the only ones who could be. Like, men were not permitted to be by the mother when the child was born, and women were the only ones who were permitted to handle the body at death. Men were not permitted to do those kinds of funerary, the prothesis, the kind of preparation that would be done was what had to be done by women. And frequently you will see that. I mean, even represented in other cultures many years later, you often see the body being prepared by the women of the house for burial, because women were seen to have this kind of inherent magical power, which makes them both pure and impure, can potentially make them pure and impure at the same time. And thus, as she was pointing out in this chapter, she said, in a way, it's almost like the ritual purity meets the taboo, like they're occupying the same space, which is actually kind of a very tantric thing. It's the idea that what we think of as the pure and what we think of as taboo merging into one space. And that's typically something that only happens in liminal spaces, when you have these kinds of transitions between two states. But these are not the states where we feel comfortable. We feel like this is a state where the regular rules do not apply. And so we don't want to be in those states. Like for social reasons, we say, well, we can't be in that place because that place is potentially dangerous because it's on the edge. So anybody who works anywhere on the edge, it may or may not have a very comfortable relationship in society when you deal with that kind of stuff. So the Banshee becomes this kind of representation within Irish folklore of this. Of the really probably what was originally the Morrigan figure, or even other maybe sovereignty figures that might be connected to her in the literature, but probably her in particular. And that single aspect of her, because she has many, many aspects, but that aspect of her that relates to this sorrow, and it may be a particular permutation of the Morrigan as the portender of doom. In the sense that first of all, in the sense that the Morrigan only seemed to ally herself with the people who were the kings or who were the great warriors or the great heroes, because she was obviously the kingmaker. She was a representation of the kingmaker as Macha. She was a representation of the that feminine that conferred sovereignty, and so she would also be the one that sort of follows the sovereign to their doom. It kind of fits in with the whole idea of a guardian spirit that follows the noble throughout their lifetime. And but this aspect may have become revived, and there may have been a much more intense interest in the Banshee legend, or there may have been this revived, maybe even just a revived experience of the Banshee when the English started to come in and started to take those lands from the Irish by force. So it's the idea of the sovereignty of Ireland is being ripped away, and the Banshee is wailing and mourning that particular event. And so, particularly when it happens to those who have had a long ancestry in Ireland, I suspect the reason it might not be, maybe not so much Saxons or Normans, is because those people are also considered to be invaders. Maybe they've assimilated, but they're not necessarily part of these original clans. Although, again, if you look at the Book of Invasions, and if you think they're well, you want to look at them with a grain of salt, certainly at the very least with regard to historical accuracy. But the idea is that you have these you've had many peoples that have come and gone throughout Ireland, and some of them are mythical, as far as we know. And I don't know that it seems to be the Milesians, which are supposed to be the descendants of current humans. Although interesting, Milesian ancestry may be traced more back to the travelers of the Iberian Peninsula. You'll hear about the Spanish Irish, and that is a thing. I mean but they seem to be connected very much to that. The idea of the Milesians may be connected to what we now think of as the travelers, what used to be called gypsies, but now that's considered to be disparaging. From what I've heard, that at least the ancestry and the DNA may actually, the quote unquote Milesian ancestry may actually come from the travelers. But anyway, be that as it may or not, certainly that was considered to be that last race, the race that actually battled the Tuatha De Danann, and they basically divided things up. Like the Milesians lived in the upper world, and the Tuatha De Danann lived in the other world, beneath the mountains. So that's kind of where that mythology comes from. But you still see these women of the Sidhe, of the mounds, coming to still kind of guard these really old families that have been connected to probably some of the most ancient sovereignty of Ireland. So very interesting, and interesting in the sense of, we see this idea of keening and lamenting as a magical act. And I think that's what the subtext is here. You're looking at something that is magical in nature, and it's so the fairy. So this lament and this keening is in a way a magical act. Like this person is showing up as as kind of the psychopomp, the one who's going to guide the dead soul to the next realm. And that was, I think, the question that I ended with was: are the banshees just there to give omens of death, or do they actually act as guardians up into the end? And the suggestion might be here, and while again this is maybe not explicitly stated, first of all, if they're family guardians, then yeah, I would think that they are basically guarding the family member right up until their last breath and their transition to wherever it is that they're going to go. But also the very fact of their mourning cries. If we think about the mourning cry being part of funerary rites in a lot of places, and even still, like you will have example, you don't really see it. You go to a typical Western, even a Catholic funeral, really. Unless you belong to a culture that tends to still engage in those kinds of practices when dealing with the coffin and with the burial and everything. I have seen examples of that still happening. Particularly, I've seen it in Italian culture. I have seen that kind of. I won't go as far as to call it keening, but there is this kind of behavior of maybe throwing oneself on the casket, or weeping and so forth. Like that seems to be very much connected with that. But I don't want to say that's exclusively something that I see out of that culture. I mean, certainly it's elsewhere as well. But you don't typically, like if you go to a funeral parlor here in the U.S. for a typical funeral, I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've seen anything happen that would be like a funeral lament. It doesn't really, it's not really a thing that's done. But the practice is one. And it definitely seems to have a kind of magical connection to bringing someone to the other world or whatever the next space that the soul goes to when they pass away. So it's interesting that the song itself, I think, is as important as the omen that it presents, because that song is there to provide that guidance away from the earthly realm, or I shouldn't say away from the earthly realm, away from the realm of the living into the realm of the dead. So that is it for me for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you do enjoy these podcasts and you would like to support it all, please consider checking out patreon.com/Chthonia and supporting my work. I usually give a big thank you to my patrons to the paying members at the beginning of the episode, but of course you can still join as a free member if you would like, and I do try to give updates to things that are more public. I also try to update people on Patreon, free members as well, but things that are more substantive updates and things are usually for those who are subscribers. So you can consider subscribing there. If you want to check out all my work, you can visit Chthonia.net. I do have some new books that have come out this year, and there's going to be some more stuff coming out later this year, mainly fiction books right now. So if you check out Chthonia.net/publications, you can see a list of everything. I apologies for not having images on that page. I want to have like thumbnails before everything, but for some reason, WordPress will not let me put thumbnails in. I have to either put big images of the books in, even if I indicate them as a thumbnail. It puts like this huge 8.5 by 11. I'm like, okay, no, this is not going to do for a catalog. So short of making it a PDF that people have to download, which is not, which is troublesome in its own way. Basically, I just have the descriptions there, but I do have the links to where people can order the books and the ebooks for each of those titles. And because there's a number of them that are out right now under Chthonia Books, and also have links to my things that are published outside of Chthonia Books. So definitely can check that out if you want. All the podcasts are listed there. If you haven't, if you want to catch up with them in the audio versions, certainly if you're watching on YouTube, subscribing on YouTube is great. That really helps me out as well on the Chthonia channel, if you're not subscribed there already. And if you want to check me out on social media, it's Chthonia Podcast, one word on X and IG. And again, I'm mostly on Instagram and not on X. And it's 2 words on Facebook. And it is just Chthonia on YouTube, but if you do an @ after youtube.com/@, it would be Chthonia Podcast, one word. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.